My son, after over 2,000 years, I have returned. Your Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Nah, not really. It's just me. But you're happy to see me as well, right? A while ago, I made a production entitled Atheism Is a Religion, whereby I explained why I believe that the modern atheist movement, both organisationally and psychologically, has ironically actually started to resemble a religion in of itself. Near the end of that production, I briefly alluded that I believe that atheism will start to fizzle out in the future, and that religion will actually have a huge resurgence, contrary to the majority opinion of today. Throughout this production, it will be my aim to explain why I believe that atheism is doomed. Now, we all know what it is that atheists believe. That religion is naught more than a relic of a bygone era. Merely outdated superstitious nonsense that is holding mankind back from reaching its full potential. Hence, why they do everything they possibly can to disparage it. And with lower rates of religious attendance across much of the Western world as of recent decades, many atheists have since become confident that religion is indeed on its way out. When you ask the average atheist what they think the future will now look like, they will very likely tell you about this fantasy of space. Venturing out from Earth, living on Mars, creating colonies across the cosmos. No gods, no kings, only man. Everyone enlightened. Everyone smart, everyone an atheist. Such is the inevitable endgame of mankind. Unfortunately, however, like all utopian beliefs, I'm afraid that reality might be a little bit different than what they might expect. As from my observations, this irreligious Star Trek-style fantasy is most certainly not the immediate future of mankind. Not even close, in fact. But in order to prove this point, I'm not going to talk about politics or religion, but something that atheists themselves love to worship. Science. We've all heard of natural selection, a biological calculation that determines who we wish to be our mate and ultimately reproduce with. Subconsciously, men tend to desire women who are cosmetically attractive, as beauty often indicates good health, which is a valuable inheritable trait for their next of kin to have. Women, on the other hand, tend to desire men who are good resource gatherers, as with such resources, their next of kin should have a higher chance to survive. Hence why men tend to borderline worship beautiful and young women, while at the same time treating unattractive and old women very poorly. And why women tend to want to court wealthy and ambitious men, while not giving poor and unambitious men the time of day. Of course, there are always exceptions, but nevertheless. To put it bluntly, because of natural selection, throughout history, poor men and unattractive women tend not to breed, whereas rich men and attractive women tend to, with the subconscious belief being that our offspring will be of a higher quality should we prioritise such traits in the opposite gender. And thus from that, the chance of humanity continuing to survive will be higher. Of course, we often like to frame romance in a more poetic and humanistic fashion, but nevertheless, behind the curtain, a cold scientific calculation is ultimately all that it is. This process of natural selection over the course of thousands of years is the reason why you, I, and everyone else on this earth exist. You are the result of thousands of years of rigorous selection. Feels good. And it's like this for practically all forms of biological life, not just human beings. The weak wither, and the strong survive. But if natural selection works on an individual level, then who's to say it can't also work on a collective level? This concept is what I like to call civilizational natural selection. I define a civilization as a set of cultural values and beliefs that are repeatedly passed down from generation to generation. And while such civilizations may go through numerous ups and downs, because of this passage process, they nevertheless tend to last for millennia, with their cultural values and beliefs ultimately remaining throughout the ages. Obvious examples of civilizations would be the Christian and Islamic civilizations, whose values are centered around the Bible and Quran respectively. Both books serving as the cultural bedrock of their societies for generations. But the modern atheist movement and its associated ideologies, such as progressivism, feminism, and individualism, are not and can never be classified as a civilization. As all civilizations, such as Christianity and Islam, are about making a unified, continuing collective. The modern atheist movement, on the other hand, is about putting the rights of the individual above any collective. The main defining feature of the modern Westerner is, after all, individualism. The narcissistic idea that they, as an individual, are the centre of the universe, and that the wider collective society at large must always bow down to their individuality, and never try to get in the way of such freedom. And because individualists don't think about anything but themselves, to them, children, which are the lifeblood of any civilization, are viewed not as a gift, but a burden. Why have children, which would cost lots of my money to maintain? Why have children, which would take up much of my attention? Why have children, which would get in the way of my precious career? Thus, they abdicate the responsibility of parenthood and instead willingly choose to sacrifice their fertility in order to enrich themselves. Hence why when such individualistic thinking is implemented in any nation, the birth rate absolutely plummets and the population starts to decline. A civilization must revolve around a set of collectivistic values. A civilization cannot be, however, a soulless individualistic hell that stands for nothing but consuming products, such as what we see today in the modern decadent West. The idea of civilizational natural selection is that any civilization that goes on to become occupied by individualism will fundamentally end up committing collective suicide. But that from their ashes, a new civilization will inevitably take its place, due to their predecessors' reliance on them. I understand that this is quite a complicated phenomenon to comprehend, so let's visualize it numerically. Imagine a country that was made up of two groups, the first being the believers, holding conservative, traditional, religious, collectivistic and self-sufficient beliefs, making up around 100,000 people. And the second group being the disbelievers, holding progressive, feminist, atheistic, individualistic and globalized beliefs, but make up around 1 million people. In this example, the believers would be outnumbered by the disbelievers by a whopping 1:10 ratio. However, the believers value family far more than the disbelievers, and thus, to use an arbitrary figure, if the believers would have around 3 children on average, whereas the disbelievers would only have 1, then, as it takes 2 to tango, this would mean that with every generation, the amount of believers would go up by 33%, but the amount of disbelievers would go down by 50%. Let's see what this arrangement would look like over the course of just 5 generations. Quite the religious return. Over the course of just 5 generations, the disbelievers and their ideals would be almost completely irrelevant. But the believers, and thus the civilization of the believers, would soon become supreme. And thus, the cycle of civilizational natural selection has completed. And this process of civilizational natural selection is not just a theoretical fiction either, but an actual observable phenomenon. In fact, all 3 of the major Abrahamic religions are currently undergoing such a transition in their own unique ways. First, let's talk about the rise of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. Israel, contrary to popular belief, has a population that is actually quite divided when it comes to how dedicated one is to religion. Some Israeli Jews are secular and have very little or no care for religion at all, whereas others are what is known as ultra-Orthodox, whereby Judaism plays a huge role in almost every aspect of life. In 2015, whereas the birth rate for secular Jews was just 2.1, the birth rate for the ultra-Orthodox was a whopping 6.7. This means that whereas in 2020, the ultra-Orthodox made up around just 1 in 10 people in Israel, by 2050, this number is expected to rise to 1 in 4. From my talks with secular Jews in Israel, I am told that this huge demographic transition makes them somewhat concerned for the future of the nation's stability, both socially and economically. Socially, they are worried because it's assumed that the ultra-Orthodox will lead the country away from having a progressive social outlook into a more conservative direction. And economically they are worried because many ultra-Orthodox men tend not to work, instead dedicating their lives to religious studies, which puts certain strains on the Israeli economy. Either way, the inevitable rise of the ultra-Orthodox and its effects on the political climate of Israel is going to be most interesting to observe over the next few decades. Next, let's talk about Christianity in the United States. Whereas the United States was once world-renowned for their obsession with the divine, ever since the 1960s, the faith has seemingly taken a back seat when it comes to setting the culture. American Christians have failed in two ways. First, starting in the 1990s, they failed on an intellectual level, unnecessarily demonizing things, such as video games, in an event today known as the Satanic Panic, which, ironically enough, only went on to create the rising atheist opposition against Christianity that we see today. When this was realized, however, they failed again. This time starting in the 2010s by conceding too much ground to the rising atheist opposition, turning a blind eye to decadent social behavior, never questioning awful inventions such as birth control, and picking and choosing what parts of the Bible to believe in a vain attempt to seem reasonable, when in reality, it just made them look weak and feeble. This has left American Christianity in somewhat of a state of limbo, fanatically popular with some, but obsessively unpopular with others at the same time. And while American Christians do have a higher fertility rate than American atheists, it's not really by much, and even still, it's likely that many such Christian children will end up abandoning Christianity into a life of sin regardless, due to the American establishment's rising cultural corruption and how intertwined many Christians are with it. So, is Christianity just doomed in America? Well, there is a light in the darkness. The Amish. Words cannot describe how much I adore the Amish. For those unaware, the Amish are a group of Christians who, for the most part, live separately from modern society, rejecting the use of technology and not getting involved with much of the artificial complexities of modern life. Essentially, they live, for the most part, as people did prior to the 20th century. Conservative and traditional, they love life and God and are almost completely self-sufficient. They grow their own food, build their own houses, and even have their own established communities. But what's most impressive about the Amish is their huge levels of growth. To say that the Amish population is skyrocketing would be an understatement, doubling every 19 years on average. Whereas the typical atheist family produces an average of barely one child, the typical Amish family produces an average of 7. In the American state of Pennsylvania, back in 1992, there were just 32,000 Amish people. 30 years later in 2022, and this number had almost tripled to 86,000. And such growth rates are similar in other states with an Amish population. Ohio, from 34,000 in 92 to 81,000 in 22. Indiana, from 23,000 in 92 to 62,000 in 22. Wisconsin, from 6,000 in 92 to 24,000 in 22. And New York, from 4,000 in 92 to 22,000 in 22. In 2020, there was an estimated total of 345,000 Amish people in the United States currently, but by 2050, this number is expected to almost triple to 800,000 people. Should such growth rates continue, by the year 2200, the Amish population is estimated to exceed the entire rest of the United States population. I, for one, welcome our new Amish overlords. Laugh as you may now, but I genuinely believe that in the future, the Amish are going to play a massive role in American life, and may well prove as inspiration for the rest of Americans' Christians to follow. That is, of course, assuming they're left alone. I fully anticipate the amount of Christians as a percentage of the US population to decline throughout the rest of the early 21st century. And likewise, the amount of atheists should increase in tandem, to the point whereby they will even overtake the Christians due to cultural decay. During this time, the United States will significantly degenerate and become increasingly unstable with each year that passes, as individualism begins to destroy the nation and people's quality of life starts to plummet. It's also borderline guaranteed that the new Christian minority, including groups like the Amish, will also start to become persecuted in some way by this new atheist majority, whether being attacked by the media or trying to pass laws that restrict the Christian lifestyle. In response to such persecution, I fully anticipate that all Christians, even the pacifistic Amish, will become much more zealous. However, if civilizational natural selection is allowed to continue, then the amount of atheists and Christians should normalize again at some point in the future, due to a combination of 1. Newfound religious zeal against tyranny, 2. Higher Christian birth rates, and 3. Immigration from South America, which is likewise quite Christian. A similar return to religion has been witnessed before in the former Soviet Union, whereby Christianity and Islam was persecuted and then ultimately revived after its fall. However, if this persecution against Christians proves to be really harsh on an almost totalitarian level, then it is actually possible that such atheists could retain their grip on power in America for way longer than what would have otherwise been, which would lead to an absolutely hellish dystopia beyond comprehension. I suppose only time will tell. Either way, protect the Amish. Next, let's talk about Islam in Western Europe. If you thought the state of Christianity in America was a state of decay, then you clearly haven't seen that of Western Europe. So much so that I have called Christianity in Western Europe a zombie religion, for it is both dead and alive at the same time. People here may call themselves Christians and baptize their children, but they never really read the Bible nor go to church. The faith has become naught more than a toothless item of fashion, a historical artifact, always viewed from the past tense. The Christians of Western Europe have, for the most part, abandoned their faith and traded it for atheism, prioritizing things that don't really matter, such as worldly wealth, careers, and social status, while at the same time sacrificing that which does: family, culture, and religion. Yet Europe is of course renowned for its massive socialist programs, such as healthcare and welfare. But now, due to having a rapidly aging population that isn't producing enough children, many European countries have found that they now can't even function properly. Hence, why their governments have requested the assistance of immigrants from abroad, such as, most notoriously, Muslims from the Middle East, to help prop up such dying economies. During my studies reading the Islamic Quran, I was baffled to see that civilizational natural selection of this kind was mentioned on numerous occasions. Many societies have passed away before you, so travel the earth and note the fate of the deniers. Whoever of you goes back on his religion, Allah will bring a people whom he loves and who love him, kind towards the believers, stern with the disbelievers. Have they not considered how many generations we destroyed before them? We had established them on earth more firmly than we established you, but we destroyed them for their sins, and established other civilizations after them. If only there were, among the generations before you, people with wisdom who spoke against corruption on earth, but the wrongdoers pursued the luxuries they were indulged in, and thus became guilty. We destroyed generations before you when they did wrong. Their messengers came to them with clear signs, but they would not believe. Thus, we requite the sinful people. Then we made you successors on earth after them, to see how you would behave. And the Quran is right, and that's exactly what's happening. The death of Christianity in Western Europe has created a void of civilization that is slowly being filled by Islam. This has, naturally, led to numerous right-wing movements against Islam in Western Europe, which tend to be based on either Christianity, nationalism, or both. However, because of the average Joe's unavowed atheism due to pseudo-intellectualism, and absolute aversion to nationalism due to its association with the two world wars, such movements tend to be remarkably unsuccessful, with the electorate continuing to vote for neoliberal fantasies instead. And while this could certainly change, personally, I think people are far too individualistic. People often get angry at me when I say that I actually admire Islam's rise in Western Europe. Because, as hard to believe as this may sound, as a man of God, I find that I have much more culturally in common with the average Muslim immigrant than I do the average atheistic Brit. As whereas the average Brit now celebrates decadent behaviour and bathes in bourgeoisie greed, I find that I and the Muslims both tend to find such behaviour to be mutually abhorrent. Thus, if the nations of Western Europe wish to surrender to atheism, then my advice to European Christians and nationalists at large, as unbelievable as this may sound, is to actually do the unthinkable and turn to Islam. As religiously, considering the entire basis for Islam's existence is that it is simply Christianity but uncorrupted, then it surviving in the face of Christianity's decline should truly speak wonders. And civilizationally, Islam likewise is, whether people like it or not, a real civilization that has survived for over 1,400 years and counting, and thus clearly has the potential to last should it become the new status quo. I believe that much like the United States, the amount of atheists will officially outnumber the amount of Christians in Western Europe, again at some point in the early 21st century. But so too will Islam rise, and by the late 21st century, as the atheists begin to decline, Islam will only continue to rise and eventually even overtake the atheists. Though not just by births, but also reversions, as those who would have been previously Christian now find themselves swayed by Islam's clear success. And for those who laugh at the possibility of an Islamic Western Europe, I say that they should remember that Europe used to be dominated by paganism, and Christianity itself was once viewed with similar laughter as nothing more than an irrelevant cult. That was, of course, before it became the absolute status quo across the continent for over a millennia. In fact, I will even make another very bold prediction and say that by 2100, Western Europe will be even more dedicated to Islam than even the Middle East. As I believe that throughout the 21st century, whereas Western Europe will have a religious revival, the Middle East will have a secular one. Such is the eternal cycle of order and chaos. But that's a story for another time. So, there you have it, civilizational natural selection. As the religious value family and fertility, whereas atheists value worldly wealth and social status, then all religious populations should skyrocket, whereas all atheist ones should collapse. When it comes to civilizational natural selection, however, there is an elephant in the room, and that is the assumption that children will always inherit the beliefs of their parents. And while this is and has been historically mostly true, many atheists are of course aware of their demographic crisis, hence why they have opted to focus on indoctrinating children away from religion. This is, after all, as stated earlier, why I expect the amount of Christians in both the United States and Western Europe to decline throughout the early 21st century, as they are being converted to atheism. If the atheists do manage to corrupt enough children away from faith, then civilizational natural selection will become slowed. Hence why religious people living in rising secular societies should defend their faith from such attempts so that the destruction of this chaos can be accelerated and order can be restored once more. But nevertheless, even in the unlikely event that religion was to completely die off in the West just as the fanatical atheists dream of, on a global level, the world at large will be having a religious boom regardless. Just ask our well-respected friends at the World Economic Forum.
How religious will the world be in 2050? According to recent research, the growth of religious populations worldwide is projected to be 23 times larger than the growth of the unreligious between 2010 and 2050.
Gee, Klaus, that's awesome. In 2015, the amount of Christians in the world was estimated to be around 2.2 billion, or 31% of the world population. Muslims were around 1.7 billion, or 24% of the world's population, and atheists were around 1.1 billion, or 16% of the world's population. But by 2060, the amount of Christians is projected to increase to 3 billion, or 31% of the world population, an increase of 800 million people. Muslims are projected to increase to 3 billion likewise, also being 31% of the population, an increase of 1.2 billion. And this growth of both religions is of course driven primarily by giving birth. Atheists, on the other hand, are projected to only increase to 1.2 billion, or just 12% of the world population, an increase of just 37 million. Be fruitful and multiply clearly means nothing to these people. I suppose one should not be too surprised, however, that atheists, who so notoriously believe that killing their own children is a human right, would not exactly blossom in population. While we're on this topic, it should also be noted that whereas affinity to religion used to be seen purely as a result of environmental factors such as upbringing, over the last few decades, many scientists now believe that perhaps genetics may also contribute to one's belief in the divine, which has even led to some scientific models suggesting that religion will dominate society in the future due to said gene becoming so commonplace, which, no pun intended, only further affirms my beliefs. Granted, having a genetic predisposition to religion does not necessarily mean that people are guaranteed to immerse themselves in what we typically think of as religion, as after all, the modern atheist movement itself can be classified as a religion in of itself. In fact, from my observations, those who tend to be the most fanatical of atheists also tended to have very fanatically religious parents, which is certainly not at all a coincidence. Though this is ultimately irrelevant, as anyone who did embrace such would simply undergo civilizational natural selection themselves, but nevertheless. The fanatical atheists love to make bold claims that religion is a thing of the past, and that the believers must catch up to them. Progress, as they call it. But the truth is, as I've said many times before, that they are only progressing to their own graves, and that the future belongs to those who value the next generation, not just their own. So yes, the future looks to be more religious, but that's not the only change that civilizational natural selection will bring. Ever since the 1970s, psychologists have noted that the average IQ across the Western world has actually started to decrease. World Economic Forum, IQs are falling and have been for years. Yahoo News, researchers say Western IQ dropped 14 points over last century. CNN, IQ scores are falling and have been for decades, new study finds. And, let's face it, this phenomenon really isn't that hard to notice. I mean, just look at Reddit. The question is, however, why? Well, as any psychologist will tell you, IQ is a mix of genetics and education. And so if IQ is decreasing, then the responsibility will ultimately lie to one, if not both, of these factors. Now, the education system, as stated earlier, is more like an indoctrination system by today's standards, with most teachers having less of an interest in teaching and more spreading their own political agendas. But there is also a genetic reason for this decline, and that is that since the introduction of feminism in the 1960s, high-intelligence women tend to focus on education and careers during their most fertile years, which often results in less or even zero offspring. Meanwhile, at the same time, low-intelligence couples, who tend to breed without much delay, are actually being financially rewarded for such actions due to generous welfare schemes. So whereas in the past, when intelligence often correlated with survival, intelligent people would tend to breed much, whereas those who weren't simply tended not to survive. Today, however, the exact opposite is proving true, and this overall results in an average lower IQ with every generation that passes. And, as no doubt people will mention it, back in 2006, a movie by the name of Idiocracy was released with this exact plot. Set in a dystopian future where human intelligence has depleted and society completely collapses as a result. So much so that people are now trying to grow plants using energy drinks. Now, I don't think that reality will ever get that bad. However, it does show that feminism, aka the attempt to fool women into thinking that working for their husband is oppression, but working for their boss is liberation, will have significantly negative long-term consequences for humanity at large. Riddle me this. If the purpose of life is to reproduce and survive, which, judging from the modus operandi of every biological life form on our planet, seems to be the case, then we should ask ourselves why gender even exists in the first place. As after all, surely it would make much more sense if everyone could reproduce with everyone? Yet whatever made us, whether it be God or evolution, made the conscious decision to split humanity up into two distinct types, instantly decreasing our raw mathematical survival rate by 50% because it nevertheless thought that there was a good reason to do so. And that good reason is that men and women exist as two separate genders, as we have different roles to play in society. Roles of equal importance, I might add, but certainly different, and any attempt to muddle with these roles will only result in initiating civilizational natural selection. It seems like all mankind's attempts to rewrite our innate divine design through godless utopian ideologies always seems to backfire on us, in one way or another. Checkmate, atheists. And as mentioned earlier, the consequences of feminism, which ultimately is the decline of mankind's average cognitive abilities, is the reason why the atheist space fantasy is just that, a fantasy. The only people who are going to be going to space are the immensely wealthy, as at the rate we're going, it would be surprising if humanity actually managed to maintain our own planet, never mind colonize another. Whew, that's a lot to take in. Let's have a recap. Overall, civilizational natural selection dictates that because atheism and its associated ideologies do not prioritize family, it cannot be classified as a valid civilization, and thus must rely on real civilizations, such as Christianity and Islam, just to function. And because antinatalism is ingrained so strongly in the individualist atheist mind, it is inevitable that such collectivistic religious people will become the new status quo. However, as a result of intelligent women being artificially taken out of the gene pool due to feminism, an unrelated byproduct will also be a lowering of average IQ. So essentially, if I'm right, then the future is going to be much more religious, but also much more dumb. So, we've got a good thing and a bad thing, I guess. For those of you who are annoyed by the decadence of modern Western society, you should take comfort in knowing that this current chaotic status quo is all naught more than a fad, a failed human experiment in trying to overrule divine design, doomed to transmogrification. And the logical response to finding yourself in this kind of dystopia is to become more religious, more prosperous, but most importantly, don't let this period of temporary decline get you down. In the past, humans were under threat by disease, famine, and war. Now, our own flawed attempts at role-playing as God and trying to overrule his divine design have become mankind's worst enemy. But it isn't God, or the concept of God, that will be dealt a fatal blow, but those who dared try to replace him. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that, and before you go, I want to know in the comments section down below, what do you think of civilizational natural selection? As I find that whenever I propose this idea to people, they think I'm insane. They say, what, the Amish are going to take over America? You know, this sounds absurd, but again, it's a mathematical calculation. You know, it's not a political opinion or some sort of religious proclamation. It's simple science. You cannot have a civilization that doesn't respect family. I mean, civilizations rely on continuity, and family is continuity. So it is what it is, but I'm curious to see what people think. And, as some of you may have heard, I now have a Patreon exclusive podcast. See what I did there? Exclusive, pretty good, eh? So, to anyone who signs up, you will be able to listen to me jabber on, kind of like as I am doing now. I've received a lot of positive feedback on it thus far, so I'm looking forward to making some more stuff for it. And you'll be able to, of course, join the Wall of Fame, and let's face it, who doesn't want to join the Wall of Fame? Look at these fantastic, glorious, wonderful people, to whom I owe so much. So yeah, expect much more religious topics, I suppose. I hope you don't mind that. You know, a lot of people have told me that the spirituality productions tend to be their favourites, so I hope that's the case. But nevertheless, I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you next time.